passionate about. So I was really excited to have all of these people that are pioneering with different elements of building diversity in cropping systems, from the intercropping session and the integrated pest management, building pest resilient systems, which will happen after this. So this was really just take some time to give you guys a chance to ask questions, share your experiences, ask some of these guys some questions. I've got some questions too. We've got an hour, but we've also got bits and bobs to have a look at afterwards, and some of us do need to get off quite promptly, so we'll probably finish a bit before time anyway. But I guess, yeah, just maybe we'll kick off if you guys could just briefly say who you are for people that weren't in the previous session, and obviously those that are in the next session, who you are and what you're up to in the world of diversity. Richard?
Oh, me? Okay. Yeah, so my name's Richard Powell. I work for Centre for Ecology and Hydrology at Wallingford, just down the road. Very briefly, I've worked on agroecological research with people like Marek Novakovsky for 24 or 5 years now.
Seems but a day.
Currently lead the Achieving Sustainable Agricultural Systems research programme, which you'll hear more about after lunch if you join the session.
And that's with integrating habitat into cropping systems, yes. So integrating strips of habitat. Julian?
Julian Gold. I'm a farm manager, conventional use pesticides. So being a farmer, I'm an expert in nothing. I'm trying to farm sustainably and trying to sort of move our farming further down the spectrum towards organic farming, using less and less pesticides, building diversity. We're doing quite a lot of things with soil health, but we're doing quite a bit of work with Richard and CEH. We've got assist strips around the fields, and we're doing other things with machines, monitoring greenhouse gas fluxes in and out of the fields. So really just trying to move conventional farming to a better place ecologically.
Brilliant. Marek?
Marek Novakovsky, environmental consultant and agronomist.
And your specialism?
The works of Jane Austen.
Poland in the Second World War. Yeah. No, I provide hopefully a sort of a reality check for CH when they're involved in agriculture and environmental research, and do quite a lot of work with DEFRA Naturally.
Smith. I'm now at the Centre for Agricology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University. Previously I was at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and it was there that I did a lot of work on diversifying farming, looking at field margins, how to construct them and where to place them.
Andy Howard, farmer from Kent, arable, no-till conventional farmer, also a Nuffield scholar, so I did my scholarship on intercropping, and we grow a wide range of crops. Same as Julian, we're not organic, but we're reducing our inputs every year by different tools.
Charlotte Rowley, I'm a crop protection scientist at AHDB, which is the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board. So I manage our pest research, mainly in arable, and one of our crop protection research is focused on IPM and trying to move towards an over-reliance on pesticides. Away from reliance on pesticides. So more like IPM.
I'm Charlotte Bickler. I'm crops and breeding researcher at the Organic Research Centre. I coordinate the intercropping field lab, innovative farmers. We work with Katie on that and a group of farmers, including Andy. And so that's part as well of the Diversify project, which we spoke about in the last session, which has got lots of elements to it, and pure research, but also on-farm research. But my main area of interest is in increasing diversity at a genetic level within fields, and working at variety trials, also variety mainstream as well. So, yeah.
Adrian Newton from the James Hutton Institute, which, for those of you who don't realise it, was a Scottish Crop Research Institute down in the Macaulay Land Use Research Institute, put together 6 years ago now. I'm supposed to be a serial pathologist, but I take more interested more in crop interactions now, particularly things like variety mixtures work over the years. So that sort of area. And we sort of lead the Diversify project from Hutton as well. So I said I should take issue with that description of a farmer as expert in nothing. I think you're an expert in applied systems biology.
Absolutely, and definitely what we're seeing with
Right,
the intercropping is that there's so much innovation, lots of this stuff, that innovation's happening in the farmers' field. So I guess that's why we were interested to get you all together with these guys to hear as well what you're all doing. Has anyone tried out intercropping, companion cropping, or some IPM practices with putting habitat into farming systems? Joe? I know you have. What?
Yeah, so Joe from Army Organic, we're a 4,000 acre, 100% organic farm in North Norfolk. So we specialise in vegetable production. We're responsible for, I think, 85% of all the organic carrots in the UK that are sold. So we are essentially creating habitats within our carrot fields and introducing beneficial insects into those. So we have permanent beneficial strips around all of our fields, but we're basically trying to get those insects further into the field, if you like. So we've been introducing ladybirds, parasitic wasps, hoverfly, quite a substantial amount of insects over the last 3 years. Obviously organically we can use certain not insecticides but equivalent of, if you like. So for the first time last year, by using beneficial insects, we didn't use any, so it's quite a successful approach. Some of the things that we struggle with is because carrots are grown once every 7 years, you can't necessarily have these habitats within fields permanently. So the thing we've really struggled with is how do we grow strips in fields in a spring and get them flowered and, you know, create a habitat that insects can actually thrive in that 1 year. So trying to move towards autumn sown is the ideal scenario, or permanent based is the ideal scenario, but autumn based doesn't always work. You know, when you're ploughing and cultivating fields, to have permanent strips every 30 metres can be quite challenging from a efficiency point of view.
Yeah, and what kind of size strips have you got?
So they're the width of a bed, so we try to put them in the irrigation pools so that they're simple and they're not really wasted as such, but in a, say, a typical 25 acre field we'll have 4 or 5 strips across the field. So financially we're losing quite a substantial amount in terms of cropped area, but from a crop overall perspective you're not really losing anything, because the value in the crop that survives and thrives is higher, if you like, by doing that. So.
And what kind of species have you got in the mixture?
There's quite a mixture actually, a lot of clovers and radishes, so we want things that are going to grow quickly, flower quickly, and I guess they're also having a benefit on the soil as well by using those type of species. It's not just about what they do for insects.
Yeah. And so you're looking at moving that to autumn?
Ideally permanent if we could do.
Right.
One thing that we're toying around with at the moment is going with wider strips, so going with 6 metre strips and having less of them across the field, so maybe having 3 across the field. So almost then having 3 fields within a field, if that makes sense. We're even looking into the potential of, you know, take a 25 acre field, split it in 3 and have a 7-year rotation for each individual block within a field. So that makes it very, very complex when you go down that route, but if you imagine you put carrots in the middle, onions on one side and potatoes on the other, then in theory that reduces the monoculture, it reduces the potential risk of pests coming in, because, you know, if a carrot fly comes in and there's onions there, it potentially can help from sort of repelling, if you like. We've looked at things like drilling onions around our carrot fields, and there's talk of marigolds supposedly work quite well. So we're just starting to look at some of these. One of the things that we've looked at to try and combat the fact that we can't spring sow is actually transplant, which is quite costly, but look at transplanting cloves and radishes in the spring.
Yeah.
So you're essentially starting with a bigger plant.
Yeah.
So
Interesting, yeah. And how does that compare to some of your experiences?
Well, yeah, it's very interesting. It's almost as if you've been reading our protocol. No, great. I think great minds think alike. I think with the Assist project, what we're trying to do is put perennial 6 metre wide strips within conventional arable fields. And Julian will come in a minute and talk about the practicalities and the reasons why that's possible. But moving to that perennial 6 metre system is the way we see we need to go because of weed control, and ultimately they become beneficial refuges. The longer you leave them, they get a structure and things can live in them and then come out into the crops. With annual systems, the resowing is a problem. You can't cut them for weed control, and their benefits, we believe, would be more transient. So, and we with our strips, we go for sort of approximately 100 metre spacing, or it fits in with the tram lines. So, whatever spray system we're using. But Julian, do you want to say something about the practicalities, because you have them?
If I can just add to that, I think that putting them in permanently is the way to go. And I think nowadays, in the days of accurate RTK and everything else, I think it's not really a big issue. But I think the $6 million question is whether you run the strips to the headland and whether you join them up. Because in my experience, it's much easier not to run them to the headland. But the ecologists tell me that it's terrible because they're not joined up to the strips around the edges. But from a practical farming point of view, if you've got a full headland width with no strip that you can work the headland, the fact that the permanent strips are in then doesn't really create any issues with guidance, because effectively, like you say, you're just dividing your field into different little fields within a field. And it works quite well, other than this $6 million question, strips to the end, or stop the strips on your headland width.
Yeah, I think because they're perennial, I think they will become colonised, and they will. I think they'll be viable, but we're monitoring that at the moment.
But how do you find the management year on year? Does it not get colonised by grasses and too dominated?
Marek, you manage them.
The establishment is key to the whole thing. Certainly, over the years that I've worked with annuals and perennials, perennials offer a wider range of farming and environmental benefits. There are some selective herbicides that can slow the grass down, providing it's on the label, etc., etc. But the time and the frequency of mowing in year one, once you've got these things perennially established, they might not even flower in year one. And I think this is the mistake a lot of people make. It starts nice in year one, and then somebody suggests you mow it and everybody panics. If you're setting up something and some of the margins I've got are now in their 25th year, year one is the year you set it up, and if it doesn't flower, so be it. Blackgrass is the major issue, and if you start mowing end of May, if your nerve stands it, early June, when the blackgrass has just finished flowering, 3 mows a year would get you through most of the problems in year one. And then depending on the fertility, you might have to mow again in the spring the following year, so you go through the summer flowering period without the whole thing collapsing. But the majority of grass ingress comes from under mowing or under managing. And of course, you've got to choose the right mixture in the first place. There are some less than desirable mixtures out there where they're putting in fairly aggressive tussocky grasses. If you want tussocky grasses, then there's a limited range of flowers you can put in them to get the desired effect.
Just a shameless plug, but Marek wrote all this down in a free book. So if there are copies here.
And it's also on Agricology as well.
Yeah, and there are some copies on Cotswold Seeds stand as well. So if this is the sort of how to sow and grow the wildflower perennial mixes and annual mixes as well. If you're interested, it's focused on pollinators, but you know, beneficials in general. So just a shameless plug.
Questions?
Yeah, it was just sort of adding to it really. I manage a farm for the Wildlife Trust. We take hay as a source of seed from nature reserves. Often doing it the simple way by taking small bales of hay, and find it's a really cheap way of pepping up perhaps margins that we sold as grass margins originally, because we weren't maybe as enlightened as we are now. But just to sort of lob that in relationships with the local relationships with the local wildlife trusts can make it a much more cost-effective exercise, and then also it's very much linking in species to the locality as well.
And then what kind of distances will these beneficial insects travel? So when we're looking at putting strips in the crop, I guess that's part of what we're looking at within Assist, but how do we decide where to put them and how to put it through the field?
Well, our research shows that beneficials, ground beetles and aerial predators, sort of hoverflies and ladybirds, the benefits, we established aphid colonies in farmers' wheat, but we did tell them, but we did establish aphid colonies. And then what we did was we diligently went back every couple of days and counted how many aphids remained from the original 100 that we put there. And we took that to be an estimate of real pest control. And then we did that at different distances away from flowery margins and grass margins. And basically the point was we found that the benefits in terms of how long the aphid colonies lasted, they lasted much longer after 50 metres. So as a very crude rule of thumb, our research suggested about 50 metres and your benefits start to drop off. For crop pollinators, it's slightly further. Your wild pollinators, your bumblebees and solitary bees, will go a little further, but they don't go right to the centre of fields. Honeybees do, but wild pollinators don't. And so we had a sort of big debate about how we should space the strips, and that is obviously an economic trade-off here in terms of lost production and the numbers of corners that you might be putting into a field if you don't farm round the ends. And we sort of arrived at a very approximately 100 metre spacing, so that 50 metres from either strip is your limit. But I'm guessing other people have done similar research, so that's just our research.
We did similar, and we had ours at 20, 40 and 80, and by 40 then started to drop off.
Yes,
so
it's reassuring. Same thing.
I think the sowing to the edge of it is interesting. Sowing the middle of a strip to the edge of the field or the edge strip presents problems for farmers, but I think certainly from what we've seen in the first couple of years of Assist, the farmers that drill to the edge and then drive through that bit end up with a rather disjointed connection between field edge and strip. But if they don't have that sort of raggedy bit, there is, or I have a concern, I don't know that we've got the answer yet, but there may be some species that don't cross cereals to get to the infield strip. And I think it's a case, I take Julian's point, and he expressed the early concerns about sowing the middle strips to the edge. But I think that this is, dare I say, a process of education where the farmer sows something and then drives through it, leaving a semblance of what you sowed rather than nothing at all. And I think that's something farmers will, in the fullness of time, get used to, or perhaps have to get used to, so you get the maximum suite of beneficials crossing that no man's land.
And a few squished
I think
things.
it's also that shift in thinking, I think, because stewardship it's kind of encouraged us to think about environment and farming, and actually getting farmers to the benefit, understanding that benefit and seeing that benefit within the crop, I think, is the key part there. And
Yeah, I think that conventional agriculture believes very firmly in the things it does, and everybody has or different people have different systems, and having been at this for a day or two, until these different systems actually start communicating, there are going to be winners and losers, and there's smugness if you're a winner, and there's I'm pissed off if you're a loser. But the way forward, I think, is a bit like picking the cherries that fit your system, and if you pinch a cherry from another system, so be it. But one of the most important things that we've missed for years and years and years is people like CH and some of the organisations Julian works with aren't the best at communicating what they've done. They write a scientific paper, it sits on a shelf. We need people that take that information to the farming coalface.
Oh great, well you just led me to a brilliant plug. That's very much what we're trying to do with Agricology, is to bring together the researchers and the farmers to synthesise that. We have hubs on different practices, so it's a work in progress, but it's something I encourage everyone to get involved with and share your own experiences, and it's trying to turn that research into practice. Yes, I've got a question at the back here.
Thank you. Apologies if this is an inappropriate forum for this particular question, but I've inherited a problem, which is an intensive dairy farm, which I'm changing, and it had a slurry pit that was encouraged to leak out everywhere, so I had an ammonia poisoning issue. Is there a biological solution, either annuals, perennials, semi-permanent or permanent cropping, that I can use to deal with ammonia? If the answer is no, that's fine.
The answer is I don't know. How volatile is the ammonia?
It's been there for a long time, and it's a sludge.
It's still in the pit.
Yes.
But have you thought of effective microbes?
There's
How
virtually nothing
possible
living
is.
on it.
You mean the slurry
I was saying
approach?
effective microbes. Yeah, spray that on.
Spray on effective microbes.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know enough about them to advise any more than that.
Have you tried to grow anything at all?
Yeah. Stubble turnips, grass. It's not working particularly well.
So some of the reeds would probably be a better best. There was a session yesterday from the guy with reed beds, who would tell you that the specific reeds would cope with different levels of acidity. I can't remember his name, but
J.A. Browns.
yeah.
I mean, have you done a soil test, or have you tested the?
We're just going through that.
I think you need to look at what the pH is and what the sort of various other nutrient levels. I mean, if you can afford it, maybe look at some metal, maybe see if there are any metal problems. But it doesn't sound like it. It sounds more pH.
Yeah. Thank you.
I guess one thing I'm interested in is, so we're thinking about in-crop strips. Does anyone come across anything, or anyone trying the kind of push-pull system in kind of Western climate? So that's the idea of having something within the crop that is pushing out the pest. So it's mainly developed by Rothamsted. I don't know if anyone here from Rothamsted.
Well, I know a bit about it.
Yeah.
I wasn't involved at all. I've been reading about it a lot lately. So the idea of the system is it's used in West Africa with maize. So maize is the crop. You put this legume called desmodium between the maize. It repels stem borers and armyworms, but it can also be used as a forage, and it's a legume, so it fixes nitrogen. So it's sort of facilitating the maize growth in several ways. But then around the edge you plant this stuff called napier grass. I think there might be a couple of different options, but napier grass is the main one. It's what they call a catch crop, so that attracts the pests that are repelled by the desmodium. But then I think it's an ecological trap, so it's sticky, so they go to it, but they can't breed on it because their eggs don't hatch or they get stuck there. I can't remember the exact mechanism. But it's that nice idea that you put something in the middle that repels the pests away, and if possible has other benefits either for the crop or for the farmer, and then something around the edge that attracts those pests that are leaving.
We've done
Very cool.
something. Well, we've toyed with something similar in some work we're doing in orchards in Kent. Marek and I have worked with growers to sow a variety of species, wildflower species, to encourage pollinators, because obviously it's critical for orchard profitability. And we've thought about that idea of cutting the flowers at various times to kind of control or manipulate the crop pollination, because with apples you don't want too much pollination, you don't want too little. It's very, very critical. So for those high value systems where it's very compact within an orchard and you've got your wild pollinators, it might be something we've talked about it, we haven't done it yet because we just wanted to get the pollinator populations, you know, sort of there and present, but that could be a second phase for that work.
The limits to those systems is size. And the one in Kenya, the CP, visited there, is for smallholders, it's a small area, and it has a limit to.
Yeah, the Desmodium will work with the maize even without the trap crop.
Yeah.
So that's.
There's also the striga weed as well, wasn't it?
Yes.
Desmodium is getting the striga to germinate and have nothing to sit onto. Same as Sam Cook at Rothamsted with the. That was limited to size as well. My question would be.
Beetles. In this country, there have been trials of flea beetles control.
Limited success. Very limited.
The results.
Yeah, not very good.
That's Sam Cook we're talking about, isn't it? Was that pollen beetle? No, Sam Cook's pollen beetles with the.
But
flea beetle.
some of those trials included neonicotinoid treated seeds, so you're probably getting a false positive anyway from the trial.
I think there's potential to do it. I don't know anyone who's doing it, but there's potential to do it artificially with semiochemicals and have attractive pheromones around the edge and repellent ones in the centre. But it's an expensive method that probably won't work on most.
Yeah, Rothamsted did. Was it the 3D project in the late 80s? Professor Wilf Powell looked at moving beneficial insects into edge of crop situations by the use of attractive pheromones. So that the problem always is that the pest builds up quite quickly, the beneficials come along more slowly, farmer loses his nerve and goes for it, and then there's a lot of grumbling and the concept was that if you could move the beneficial in high numbers to where it would be needed, or your best guess of where it would be needed, but again it showed an improvement in control, but against conventional, and we're talking about against conventional insecticides, it was less beneficial to farm profits.
You could target the pest rather than the beneficials, though. You could be more specific about it.
But I think one of the things, says he with his agronomy hat on, some of the insecticides are very cheap.
Yeah, no, this is what,
I'm going to make my last visit to the field and it's going to cost me £6 a hectare to drive across the field. Do I or don't I put an insecticide in for 30p? You takes your money and I think that one of the things that there needs to be some evaluation. I think I must probably get taken outside and shot. As an agronomist, with an interest in wildlife, I find that the overuse of insecticides because of their cost is something that we actually need to give much greater consideration to. At £20 a hectare, you ain't going to spray it as often.
It's going to be either resistance or legislation.
Well, take the neonicotinoid, and I was involved with Richard on that. What we're now doing is using synthesised pyrethroids to drown insects. Is that a better bet? I'm bloody sure it isn't.
And like I say, resistance will have it in the end.
Resistance already has.
And that's what I think we're seeing
and
is
that's what's
causing
going to
this shift.
drive this sort of research into other, albeit more expensive methods, but they're really, IPM's all we've got now.
But to get engagement in this, having had a foot in both camps, you've actually got to get large-scale farmer buy-in to believe this is the direction they will eventually go in. At the moment, did I go to church this morning? God, that's going to be awful. At the moment, it is just too easy to put an insecticide in. We have the orange blossom midge epidemic each year, and the country runs out of orange blossom midge sprays. There are certain hotspots where treatment appears to be almost the norm, but I'm sure that area would shrink if it was £25 a hectare rather than a couple of quid a hectare.
Is it Denmark that's implemented the pesticide tax?
Yeah.
I don't know how that's played out.
Well, the voluntary initiative has offset that for some years now. I mean, I wouldn't want to paint the wrong picture. There are a lot of farmers that work with thresholds, but there are some that don't. And you can always find the bad apple in the barrel, which sours the whole barrel, which again is why you end up with this them and us situation, which isn't actually creating a flow of information or a greater degree of trust.
I think you've got to introduce taxes on poisons that are killing wild things. I mean, I think we've been waiting for this for rather a long time. I think you've got to use the instruments available and introduce taxes.
As long as you can afford to pay the tax, you keep using the insecticide. I think that's inherently flawed.
Certainly taxes on nitrogen and other synthetic chemicals.
No, you specifically said insecticide.
Can I take up a bit of an issue here? I've recently been commissioned by Friends of the Earth, I'm a conventional farmer, to write a report on pesticide reduction and the barriers and drivers towards implementing integrated pest management. And one of the things we actually looked at was the Danish pesticide tax. It has influenced the response from farmers in that country, in the same way the 5p tax on a carrier bag in the supermarket has influenced public behaviour in this country, about 80% drop in plastic bags. So it does work, but I think the challenge that came from it is that we've got to understand, we can't assume that all pesticides are equally toxic. And I think this is part of the problem. We don't have a way of assessing that. So the Danish model is quite interesting because it looks firstly at the toxicity to the human, then it looks at the toxicity to non-target flora and fauna, and then it looks at persistence in the environment, how long that chemical is retained in the environment and where it travels off to. Does it get in the watercourse, does it get in the hedgerows, etc. And then the Dutch one still has a basic tax element to it, which I think is just punitive and not helpful. But within that, because the problem for me as a farmer is every can of pesticide on my farm carries the same warning, it'll kill you. And I'm not able to decide or make an informed decision whether this pesticide is going to do more damage than that pesticide. I'm sure they're not all as equally toxic to non-target species or to the environment, but there's no way of equating that, and there's no way of making an informed decision. So when I get to the threshold levels, because I don't use neonicotinoids and buy insurance on my seed, I can then make an informed decision. Yes, I've got a problem. If I use this product, it'll cost me less money to go and wipe out everything. Or if I use this product and use it at night, maybe I can then limit the amount of damage I'm doing. So I think the problem is the lack of information for the farmer and agronomist is not there at the moment. And maybe some sort of system, probably taxation, because the quickest way to a farmer's heart is through his wallet. It might actually instigate that far more complex decision-making process.
Can I just add that I sometimes think that we look at these things the wrong way around. As an organic farmer, I have no choice but to be a preventative farmer. Conventional farmers are constantly looking at how do we cure a problem with a chemical, as opposed to what's the root cause of that problem and how can we prevent it.
Well, I think that's
so I think yes, tax is a thing, but it's mindset and getting farmers to think in different ways.
But when a product is significantly more expensive than 30 pence a hectare, then the farmer was going to think more creatively a couple of years ahead of problems coming forward that they can predict, and therefore they can preempt.
But you also have
which is adopting the organic.
You have to take into account the longer term problems that you create. So if I look in the I'm going to talk about carrots because that's my expertise, but if I look in the conventional carrot industry, they have huge issues with cavity spot, which is a bacterial disease. I don't get any cavity spot. Very, very rarely do I get cavity spot, and that's because my soils are alive because I haven't tried to fix it with fungicides. So, there's a whole periphery of problems that we've created by being lazy farmers, effectively. Blackgrass on our 4,000 acre estate is not an issue. We don't have blackgrass because we culturally work with the land that we have. We're not, tunnel vision and we just do, things one way and we reach to the chemical container when we have a problem. So I think we need to try and educate mindset change and people's approaches to these things.
Can we also learn from the glasshouse because I mean they use entirely biologicals in most systems now. That was driven from the buyer's perspective of wanting no residues. The actual tools to do the job, the biological control industry really rose to the challenge and is very successful on a very large scale there. So maybe that's something where it's the end user who's going to demand no use of these chemicals.
Isn't the biggest barrier to biological control the registration system? You can't actually sell it as a biopesticide because it costs you 30 million to get it through registration to prove it. So then there's plenty of products out there that
the
work.
big issue for the broadacre crops, certainly, but I mean it's been achieved in where there was the need for it in the glasshouse industry. So without that pull, that's what really changes the matter.
And to what extent do you think we should be looking at introducing biological controls versus creating habitat for what's there already? What's different thoughts around that?
I would say that with the sort of building up the natural populations of beneficials is going to give you that background control. But you know that then biopesticides or introduction of biocontrol in certain situations could give you that boost where you need it. I think it could be. It's a systems approach, as you said at the beginning, and it's about how you assemble the system. But I would say that you're going to always need that good background level, because you know that from what I know about biopesticides, they have their flaws. They're not as quick acting as a chemical pesticide. So you know they take time to build up as well. And certainly if you introduce biocontrol, that's going to take time. So you know that's the only thing I would caveat I would put on it is that you need that both.
Yeah. What's your experience, Joe? I mean, how do you keep them? They're obviously in a protected cropping system. They're much more contained. What's your observations in terms of?
We naturally see higher pest pressure because of the environment that we've created to try and create the perfect environment for beneficial insects, because at the end of the day they're both like the same thing, they both live off the same things. So naturally we see the levels of both increasing. The challenge for us is how do you get beneficials in time to keep up with the peak in pest pressures, and that's where the introduction of beneficials has had a positive effect for us. So I think it's actually very hard to get the two in balance without introducing.
So it's kind of about observation, like knowing your thresholds, basically.
Yeah, I mean we know our pests inside out. You know, I know how carrot fly live, I know how they breed, I know what times of year they're likely to come in, I track for them. So it's not just about it's this time of year, so I need to go and do this. It's I need to understand the ins and outs of the pest, full stop, and likewise the beneficials, what the best habitats is for them. So it's a bit of a different approach. You know, you have to think more like insects, if you like. It's a bit cheesy when I say it out loud.
I think there's a lot we could all be doing in terms of learning about to be able to identify the pests and the predators, and Charlotte's going to talk a bit about that later. And we have got some samples of various different insects. But I think they're alive.
They're alive. Hobbling around.
Don't drop it.
Release them in a ceremony at the end of the day.
If there's any carrot fly, they'll want to get hooked up with him.
But I think the more we can learn about them and their life cycles and the kind of crops that might attract them. Because I often find I'm also farming, and you know you see insects and you don't necessarily know if they're a goodie or a baddie. So I think it's just learning this. There's a couple of books. There's this is the Bible. I don't know if anyone's come across the AHDB Encyclopedia on Pests and Natural Enemies. It is on Agricology and the AHDB website. But it's great for kind of having your ID and knowing those life cycles, knowing kind of when they're going to be a problem and at which point they are a problem. Do you also do a bit of work at AHDB with thresholds and kind of?
Yeah, I do a lot of research on managing between thresholds, and one of the things we're trying to move towards is almost smart thresholds in a way, so understanding how much the crop can tolerate before the pest actually becomes a problem, because having a static threshold sort of gives the illusion that any amount, this amount of pest is going to be a problem, whereas actually if you've got a really vigorous crop, that might not be the case. So trying to make it a bit more realistic in terms of like an ecosystem, but obviously that presents its own challenges in terms of the time allowed and the difficulty in using such a thing. So
I think the biggest issue is actually getting farmers to go in their fields.
this is
My agronomist gave me a recommendation for BYDV. I said, go to my field, find me an aphid. I know, it's that time of year. Find me an aphid.
yeah. Aphids are particularly difficult to find, and I think with BYDV, the risk is so high of having just a couple of aphids that agronomists are kind of inclined to just say, I'm going to watch my back here and recommend.
It's the farmer's responsibility to get out there and have a look.
But some of the decision support tools now, the AHDV, BYDV tool is absolutely fantastic. I mean, and there's other tools out there, there's Syngenta, Breakout one, and there's various other things. I think for IPM now, the sort of computer-based, web-based tools have really moved on up a notch from where they were a few years ago.
But one thing people haven't talked about with insects is the health of the plant. If you've got a healthy plant, you shouldn't, just because there's lots of insects flying around doesn't mean they're going to be on your field. And I think that's another whole subject of having a healthy plant. Shouldn't have any insect issues.
But then insects are also drawn to vigorous plants, so again it's the balance, knowing whether your crop is strong enough to overcome and go away.
Yeah, I guess there's also the pest monitoring systems, but as you say, just because it's in the area doesn't mean it's on your crop, because you've got a strong crop. Yeah.
I was just interested in people's thoughts in helping farmers make the transition. So we're using these types of systems, and you think about the input you might be putting onto a field, whether it's the form of nitrogen you're using or chemical inputs, that those are inhibiting the development of the healthy soil or fauna, which will play part of this. But you can't just stop applying one day and start doing something the next day. So how do you phase it? Do you take a leap in chunks in different areas of the farm? What's the thoughts on the transition?
I've done it 10% a year. So I reduced my nitrogen by 10% a year starting 4 years ago. I'll keep going. Reduced all other inputs by 10%. And less than no loss in yield, no.
Wow.
We're all putting far too much. Conventionally, we're putting far too much nitrogen.
Yeah.
Far too much. And nitrogen then triggers disease. Disease triggers pest issues, lodging. So everything else follows from nitrogen. So if you cut back your nitrogen and you're not seeing any yield, no problems, then.
In conjunction with that, are you not doing other things such as cover crops and
it's
like
all
that?
systems.
So it's not. It's again back to the point I made about systems. It's not very one thing. It's not just changing one thing. It's changing several things at the same time, pushing in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean it is definitely about systems thinking. I think this is where agriculture's gone down a blind alley effectively for the last few decades. We've been driven to oversimplification and it's changing that and thinking that actually nature has evolved the best system for growing plants on a unit area of land, and that's diversity. Every day we get up in the morning and go farming, we're working in the opposite direction to evolution and nature. And if we can change our mindsets and think about systems thinking, complexity, not one thing at a time, like, oh, I've got a pest in that prairie of wheat, let's reach for a chemical can. It's thinking about those overall systems, and I think that almost, if you want a way of judging how good a farm is, it's almost like the more complex a farm is, the more successful it is, because it's mimicking nature more and natural ecosystems, whereas simple monocultures, I don't see that as successful farming. It might be profitable in the short term.
Absolutely,
We had a conversation with several farming people only a few weeks ago, and the biggest problem conceptually, one of the couple of people in the room had, was we like to simplify our farming system. Therefore, we don't know how to cope with what you're saying about intercropping and all these sorts of things. Yeah, it's a problem if you're going to take that approach.
And the problem is economically, farms have consolidated and got bigger and bigger, and the bigger you get, the more simple you have to be able to manage it. Whereas actually we need a fundamental restructuring, and the farming should be going the other way, not consolidating and getting bigger. It should be getting smaller with more farmers, smaller holdings, but all the economic signals always push it in the other direction.
Could I just ask a question? We talked about markets and stuff. I mean, the things we've discussed about are being pushed by farmers, but there isn't really a market signal other than switching to organic and conversion funding that used to exist to get farmers to move down this track where it isn't going towards organic totally. So is that something, we haven't talked about retail here that much, but do you foresee that as something needed to drive or push or change the mindset and get farmers to think differently to get the reward from the market?
Is that where all the policy things and the farming payments and things like this in the future come in?
I think so, yeah.
But from the market really as well, because I think we all hang on that money and we don't know how much it's going to be in the long term, etc., and what it's specifically to go for, and it's going to take 7 years to bed in, which is also a problem. So how do we do this to the market as well, I think?
Yeah, I have heard there is a label that's about to launch. I can't remember what it's called, but it is about farming for wildlife. But I guess at the same time, it's like, do we want more labels, or is it about encouraging the practices for a system so that it's actually you're getting those benefits, like Andy's seeing on farm, that it's working. It's helping you with those gross margins, but I think there is a lot of potential within stewardship. I think Lydia Smith made a good point yesterday that those options actually can hinder that innovation because they're not necessarily on that cutting edge and defining a species and. So that if we could have a bit more freedom within that and get that system supporting.
I showed a case study of so in the US there are food hubs which are aggregation and distribution enterprises. They can be community owned or for profit or whatever. And so this one in Massachusetts is a non-profit food hub that they have a IPM certification because they mostly work with apple growers in that area, but growing organic apples in Massachusetts is really hard because it's too wet, so they have to use other systems. So they have the certification and they basically are selling everything locally, but what's interesting about it is that they're doing something that is a little bit more conventional, but within that retail system that is usually used for organic produce, but they're doing IPM. So I think it works as a differentiation tool for your produce to be different from the rest. So I'm just saying it's not just organic where it's happening, but also with other systems.
I'm on a public consultation committee for my local water company, which gives me an inside track on the issues they're having to wrestle with. And I was astonished to see that the single biggest expense for the water company in my area, which is south, is slug treatment methylhaldehyde. And we as water consumers pay a significant levy on our water bills so they can scrub methylhaldehyde with what degree of success, I don't know, I'd love to know, from our drinking water, while farmers continue to indiscriminately use it.
It's banned now.
The water, it is coming out, that's right, but the water company's way of dealing with it was not in trying to foster some biological system for dealing with the slugs, but to actually pay the farmers to use a less toxic slug pellet to swap out. And that isn't the principal reason why I'm there. I mean, for me, it's a ringside seat on the kind of industrial scale issues these people are wrestling with, plus a heads up about what's ahead, like mass poisoning. But it seemed to me they'd missed a trick there, because the water company could have fostered and used to promote itself a cultural change and said, can we work around this slug treatment? Is that possible? Should they have? What should they have been offering instead of a less toxic chemical alternative?
Just to say, we did a study of the whole of the Thames catchment, and we split it up into little sub-catchments, and we said, right, that's a very arable sub-catchment, that's an urban, that's the middle of Reading, split, and we said, right, we're going to show that farming is responsible for methylhaldehyde, and we did a big survey, and did you know, at the end of that last year, we found that the intensively arable catchments didn't have as much methylhaldehyde. The problem appear to be coming from the urban and suburban catchments, and we think it's gardeners
Oh my
who
God.
don't read the label and effectively mulch their hostas with blue gravel. And so but the stewardship campaign with the water companies, ferric phosphate, ultimately that replacement had been very effective. We found in the Thames arable catchment. So whilst farming is responsible, and I'm sure people wouldn't deny this, that they're responsible for some water pollution, be aware that it isn't just farmers. So sorry, I just wanted to make that point.
But no, that's enlightening, because that information wasn't available at the public consultation committee I was at, but that should be put out.
Well, it has, as Julian says, it's banned now.
We've just got 1 minute left. I'm going to very quickly
So I
say
want to finish with Dino. I manage 3 people funded by a water company with the Wildlife Trust, and it is farming. It's potatoes primarily, but the metaldehyde is the ground is being dredged with, and some biomass crops. So it's great news to hear that at long last, and the shame is that good stewardship just couldn't do it. At long last, metaldehyde is going to be banned, but there are 6 other pesticides in the Severn, and then Shakespeare going to the Mide. The problem is field drainage. We're the only country really in Europe that has field drainage. We keep seeing pictures of fields with slopes and erosion. Of course that happens in places. But the main problem was, we've got 6.4 million hectares that were drained as part of a government incentive so we could grow more. So part of the things we're doing working with farmers is looking much more at how to integrate things like constructive wetlands for pollution, which is an option in environment schemes, etc. But also we feel, I work with 33 farmers within this, and one of the key things we feel in terms of changing behaviour is once you've provided everything for the invertebrates, once you've provided everything for the birds, and that's still not helping, but you're still using insecticides, you're still having to use because you're sowing your wheat 4 weeks earlier than you did when I started out as an agronomist 40 years ago, that perhaps it would be useful to have things like insurance policies to help hold your hand, backed by total monitoring, so that people can take a step into saying, if I find one aphid, the agronomist is going to get sued when it comes to BYDV. There is no threshold. For arable farming, there are no thresholds for most of the things that go on in it. IPM doesn't exist in arable farming. It's insurance. So I think we need to look at ways of helping farmers not become reliant on things like insurance, but help them move steps in the right direction. If they're on heavy land and they have to plant early, which puts them more at risk, let's say, from BYDV, and you're doing everything else, like the great work that Marek and everyone is doing, but you simply put, you don't want to use insecticides, you don't want to use slug pellets, then we need to help people do that in order to build up the background of wild predators, which is suffering badly.
And I think that's very much looking at systems approaches and looking at how we can build that into the system. And that's something that we will be covering in the next session. So I will wrap up now. At 1:30 we'll be next door again with a system with a system session. Not in my room.